Hello and welcome back to Yellow Card Vanguard once again. As promised, today we're going over part 2 of our winners and losers video, this time talking about Clan Selection 2. Now before we jump straight into it, I will give a small disclaimer, and that is I haven't put nearly as much time into Clan Selection 2 testing as I have for Clan Selection 1. And the main reason for this is because Clan Selection 2 I think just feels overall a little bit worse. It's like the silver medal to Clan Selection 1. And this will become more apparent as I talk about the individual cards. But the thing with Clan Selection 2 and Clan Selection 1 is that it's just a little bit lacking. It's not quite there. Like, the things that are good in Clan Selection 2 aren't as good as the things that are good in Clan Selection 1. And the things that are bad in Clan Selection 2 are worse than the things that are bad in Clan Selection 1. Overall, in general. Like, there are a few edge cases here and there, like, you know, I think Clan Selection 2 does have the best deck in it out of all of Clan Selection, for sure. But as a whole, like as an overall product, you know, the average of the 12 clans, I think Clan Selection is just a little bit less exciting, a little bit less interesting. Now don't get me wrong, everything I said about Clan Selection 1 still holds. How fun it is, you know, to solve the decks puzzles of the 12 different clans, how interesting it is to see like all these new decks come to fruition, and how fun most of them are to play. Like, it's definitely a worthwhile investment, and I think it does breathe a little bit of much needed life into the V format. But at the same time, I think if you had to choose something to pick up, Clan Selection 1 would be my first place to look at. But without further ado, let's actually look at the individual cards and find out who's a winner and who's a loser. So we're getting started first of all with Jewel Knights and Ashley. And this was something that a lot of people were very excited about because, you know, Jewel Knights were a very underrepresented archetype throughout the entirety of G format. And to see them finally come back in the V series with a brand new coat of paint, I think it made a lot of people very happy. But when they first read the effects, it was a bit, I don't know about this. However, I do have a few friends that are very into Royal Paladin, and fortunately they've done a lot of testing on my behalf, and while the overall effects aren't very impressive, the deck itself is nothing special. I think the support itself is interesting enough, and the deck functions on its own and is viable on its own, and that alone I think is what makes the Jewel Knight support a winner. Again, you know, it's not as good as most of the Clan Selection 1 winners, but I think it's still good in its own right, and that alone I think carries a lot of weight. So moving on, next we have the Battle Sisters from Oracle Think Tank. And this one's very interesting because Battle Sister is one of many archetypes that we've had before in V series, although it wasn't defined as its own like subclan. And so when it's now it's looking specifically for the Battle Sister name and its text, you now have this sort of, okay, well I can play the old Battle Sisters, but they don't, you know, they might not work as well, like, you know, they might not be tailored to fit the game plan. And the thing is, this will start sounding like a positive, but you'll realize very quickly it's a negative, which is that the Battle Sister deck doesn't have a game plan. It's just jamming a bunch of decently good Oracle Think Tank cards together and trying to roll with it, which back in the G era was totally fine because everyone was just playing, you know, 50 generically good cards and rolling with it. But now with V series, with the power creep, with the bigger numbers, with the high consistency and everything else going on, you can't just cut it with good cards anymore. You have to have a game plan, like Gavrel, Susanoo, and Overlord trying to get as many crits as they can, or Yasui and Victor trying to, you know, spam you and overwhelm your opponent with attacks. It's not the same playing field as it were. And I think that's something that really holds the Oracle Think Tank support back, which is that it feels like it was meant for the deck a year ago, but not the deck now. It feels like it was meant to impact the game many months ago, but the game as it is now is, you know, completely different and it just doesn't fit anymore. So while the effects are very interesting and they're definitely usable, I don't think it's anything special, and it's just a more, well, here's something that you could play, but why would you ever play it over Susanoo? And it's not that much more fun to make up for it. Like, you know, it's not so interesting that it makes up for the lack in power. And so for that reason, unfortunately, I think Oracle Think Tank is a loser this time. Moving on, another piece of the hype train, we finally have the Regali support, which is Angelica. And it's kind of sad because, you know, a lot of people were expecting Minerva, some people were expecting something else altogether. But I think, you know, Angelica was one of those first cards that when it was revealed, it was like, oh my goodness, this artwork, you know, this unit, everything about it. It was one of the major break rides in the game. And so they were expecting it to breathe life into Genesis. But the problem with Genesis is actually a lot more deeper rooted. And it's something that I've had problem with Link Joker during the G era massively, which is that modern day Genesis isn't a clan. It's actually 3 clans in one trying to share a name. And what I mean by that is that sure, you have like some decently generic good cards like Glepnir and Skull and so forth, but it's not, you can't just play good cards together like you can with Oracle Think Tank or Royal Paladin. And you know, when you think about the three kinds, you've got Astral Poets, you've got Fenrir, and you've got Divine Gauge or whatever, you know, the Regalia piece, whatever you want to call them. And the thing is, they all have such wildly different game plans that it's very hard to make a deck or cards that support all of them effectively. And so we see here that Angelica supports the Divine Gauge playstyle, which is totally fine. But it means that if you're playing Astral Poets, you can skip clan selection, which I think is kind of like, you can't even build something directly to it, because then you need to go back and pick up all the old Divine Gauge pieces that you never picked up. And I think that's really sad. Same story with Fenrir. Like, you know, Fenrir's not going to randomly splash Angelica, and Angelica doesn't magically make Fenrir the better deck. As good as the effect is, I think it does, the lack of focus in the support is what really holds the Regalia pieces back here. And the second thing that's holding it back is Divine Gauge is by far and away the worst of the three archetypes for Genesis. Like, I would rather play Fenrir and I would rather play Astral Poet than Divine Gauge. And I know that Himiko Yggdrasil is a pretty decent deck, I just don't see it fighting at the same level as these other decks, especially, you know, when you look at tier 1 or even tier 2, it's just not quite there. Even in premium, people are expecting like, wow, it's a Regalia name with a force marker, I can do so much with this. And like, yes, you can do some things with it, but it's still not like, it's not, this is gonna, you know, make like, why would I rather play Regalian Premium over Loop Fenrir or Loop Valkyrian or something like that? It's just not quite there. Like, who knows, you know, we haven't had dedicated Divine Gauge support for G yet. If they print a Stride in the next premium collection, and the Stride generates Divine Gauge somehow, then definitely I can see Angelica being way, way better. But as it is right now, it just doesn't impact the game enough. Divine Gauge just isn't a good enough playstyle, so it's just not quite there. Next, we're moving on to Dauntless. And I really respect Bushy for trying the opposite that they did with Regalia here, which is abandon the popular archetype. Like, everyone was expecting even more Overlord support, or something else, or maybe even Seal Dragons, but instead we just get Dauntless, you know, a classic throwback nostalgia break ride, really decent card, but again, just like with Battle Sisters, there's no focus, there's no game plan, it's just a mishmash. And the real downside here is that because Overlord has been the focus of Kagero support for so long, and they've designed so specifically for Overlord, it's very hard now to stray from that path without accidentally breaking something. Like, you know, anything they design from now on has to bear in mind, like, but the cross exists, the end exists, the great exists, whatever. Like, Overlord has taken up so much of the Kagero design space, it's now become a problem rather than a benefit. Again, to use Legion Joker as another example, during G format, it was very, very hard to print any good Star Vader card without thinking, what if this gets used in Chaos? And there's this very similar problem here, like, that's why Dauntless doesn't 100% interact with the end. It's why Dauntless doesn't 100% interact with a bunch of other things, that people are playing Dauntless the Great rather than Dauntless the End or Dauntless the Cross. And then the problem on the other side is that if you want to move away from the Overlords, there's not enough to really make that valuable. Like, sure, you can go Dauntless Waterfall or Dauntless Nouvelle, but those just aren't, like, why would I ever play that over Overlord? And again, Dauntless himself is cool. You know, I like the card design, but it's just not interesting enough to make me want to, like, you know, abandon the power. And the even worse part is that there's a lot of forced anti-synergy here because of Overlord, and it ends up, rather than affecting the Overlord deck, it ends up just affecting Dauntless. So, you know, this perfectly innocent card from clan selection has almost, like, crippled on arrival for something that wasn't even his fault. And so it's, as much as I really wanted it to be good, I think it is a loser because it just doesn't do enough in the grand scheme of things, and it's always going to be living in Overlord's shadow. Next up in the Dragon Empire, we also have Hanzo, the new, so the name is still Hanzo, but the new name comes from his epithet. So the previous one was Akatsuki Hanzo, which means daybreak, and this one means Tasogare Hanzo, which means dusk, like, you know, twilight sort of thing. It means like from dusk to dawn, or, you know, sunrise, sunset, that sort of imagery. But the guy is still called Hanzo, like, you know, Akatsuki is not part of his name, it's his title. So that's a little bit of confusion, but a quick Japanese lesson for you there. But yeah, overall, I think this card is really interesting. Like, I love the design, you know, everyone was hailing when it came. I was like, wow, interactive design, you know, stuff during your opponent's turn. This is exactly what we've been wanting for the longest time. And I agree, it is very cool, it's very nice. However, I do think this card is massively overrated. Like, we've had effects during your opponent's turn before. We've even had riding during your opponent's turn before. I think Joker's one of the first to do it. We had another one whose name escapes me, but you know, we've seen this style of effect before, and it's been great, but it's nothing amazing. And the main problem is that it's very, very hard to do things during your opponent's turn in a meaningful way that's not broken. And so while Hanzo is cool, because it's not broken, it's really not that meaningful. And I could, you know, this could be its video in all of itself about analyzing like the numbers, whether to go protect 1 or protect 2, you know, discarding 2, is it worth it? You're getting the extra rearguard attack during your turn, is it worth it? Bouncing it to your hand during your end phase with your other rearguard so you can do it again your opponent's next turn. There's so many discussion points around this card that I'm not going to go into detail on all of them, but all I'll leave it at, you know, for the sake of keeping this video short and digestible, I think Hanzo is definitely a winner. I just don't think it is the winner. I hope that makes sense. I don't want to spend too long on it. But yeah, anyway, moving on, we then have ethics. Moving on, we then have zeal. And zeal was one of those ones that, for those of you who are in the British/Australian like culture, it's not like Vegemite or Marmite. It's one of those hate it or love it things. And I know a lot of people at first were very disappointed we didn't get the eventual return of Daikaiser, and that's a very reasonable complaint to make. However, as we've said, the issue with Daikaiser is that it would be another D-Robo, and something we've seen across all of clan selection is that they want to try and make each of these decks their own standalone deck. So you can play D-Robos in Zeal, that's fine, but they didn't want to force you to play like, you know, have to get old Dayushas or whatever, which is totally understandable. And I think they've done a pretty good job with Zeal, all things considered. They had a big task ahead of them, it was very much a challenge, but Zeal is interesting. I don't know if it's amazing, I think it's definitely decent, it's definitely solid. It's very good going second, and it's very mediocre going first, but fortunately, Dimension Police has other tools for going first that they don't mind, you know, running back on, falling back on. So there's nothing wrong with building around Zeal, and there's nothing wrong with just throwing Zeal into the mix as an alternative option. And while sure, you know, minus 5k to your opponent's units isn't exactly, it's not on brand and it's not synergistic for what Dimension Police is doing, but it's not a downside either. Like, you know, it's not going to be, you're not going to be upset to have the Zeal when it's there. So the best thing about, I think, they've done with Zeal is that it's very easy to use in all manners and scenarios. And that alone, I think, deserves a lot of credit, especially, you know, given how specific and streamlined and sort of narrow path Dimension Police design has been throughout V-Series. So yeah, I think Zeal's definitely a winner. It's not amazing, but it doesn't need to be amazing. It's just interesting enough to make you have to reconsider some other choices rather than just doing what Dimension Police has done before, which is just jamming the best cards. Next up is Dudley Lucifer. Now this one's really interesting because it was actually mistranslated on reveal. And people were like, what's the point of this card? Like, it seems really mediocre, it seems so like focused in and of itself. But the thing about Spike Brothers that people don't realize is that Spike Brothers support is generally not very interesting and the deck's never very that amazing, but it's always decent and there's always a lot of high internal synergy when it comes to Spike Brothers. You know, even Save Breed has value here, Rising Nova will make any grade 3 printed in Spike Brothers very good. And the potential for Dudley not as the center stage, but as a very powerful supporting actor, I think has definitely flown under the radar. There's already a few builds floating around that I've seen both on Twitter and on Discord, and even one that I've come up with myself, and they all have a lot of potential. Sure, they're not amazing, and they're not meant to be amazing, because they're not meant to focus around Lucifer. Like, the Dudley engine was always just a cool bonus throughout all of Spike Brothers' time. If you remember, for those of you who played back then, there was a wave of Spike Brothers support in G, where Dudley was made into its own archetype, into its own deck, you know, had stride bosses and had everything it needed, and it was still just not very good. But you could still play a few Dudleys here and there in the normal meta Spike Brothers build, because they had that flexibility. And I think Dudley Lucifer like kind of follows that trend of just being, it's pretty good, and if you build not around it, but you build to compensate it for the main focus, it can really provide you a lot of value. So yeah, it's definitely an unexpected winner, but I think that card has so much hidden power behind it from its internal synergies rather than the weight of its own strength alone. But moving on, we then have Nightmare Dolls. Now, Beatrice is, not Beatrice, Chelsea. I always get them mixed up. They look the same to me, alright? Chelsea, I think, is very, very good. When people first read it, it was like, wow, you know, it's very generic, very straightforward, and has a lot of potential. And of course, if there's one thing that Pale Moon is known for, it's its combos and its power to, like, you know, extend. And like Spike Brothers, it has that high internal synergy just through, you know, simple design and having a very clear game plan. And Chelsea contributes that massively. I think Nightmare Dolls was always like one of those, not archetypes, but like engines that you could always consider in any Pale Moon deck. You know, it was always, you can Alice into this. If you're playing G-Series, you can also Ginny into Leslie and stuff like that. And so, you know, they had a bunch of focus for them every now and again, but it never really went anywhere because it never really needed to go anywhere. Something else in Pale Moon was always like, this is the focus, be it Harry, be it Songster, be it Luquia, or whatever. And for Chelsea to finally come and say, no, Nightmare Dolls is now the focus. This is it. This is the center stage. This is pole position. I think it's a really cool design, and I think they've approached it brilliantly. Now, again, just like with the other decks here so far, I could go on and on about the potential for combos, you know, exact use cases and where it shines. But I think, you know, rather than go into those, the fact that I could go on for that long about its potential and what you can do with it should be enough to signify that it's very much a winner. Rolling straight on from there, we then have Nectaria, the Prism support. And when I first saw the original line of Prisms in the Bermuda booster, I'll be honest, I was a little bit disappointed because I am a fan of Prisms, mainly for their artwork. Their effects were never incredible, but I played them for the artwork and I was hoping that the effects would be good to follow. And unfortunately, the new series of Prisms are decent, but they're not the best. Like, you know, they're always missing that little bit. And Nectaria definitely helps, but I just don't think it helps enough. Like, as interesting as I want it to be, it's added consistency, which the deck definitely needs, but it's not added oomph. And I think the deck really needs oomph more than anything, because in V-Series, like, everyone has consistency, everyone has a way to blow you up. What you need is a way to blow your opponent up more reliably, and Nectaria just doesn't really give you that. The one cool thing I will give it is that it has synergy there along with other art builds of Bermuda, like Highlander, or, you know, there's another floating around where it's playing like Ange with Nectaria, which I don't think is very good, but it's still a thing. So it's not super restrictive like, say, Dauntless is, but at the same time, it just doesn't really do much either, just like Dauntless. I think it is still a winner, but barely, mainly because it makes a deck that was previously not that good, now very, very good, while also still having applications elsewhere. I don't think Prism becomes the best Bermuda deck, not by a long shot, but it definitely becomes a bit more playable and a bit more fun, which is, you know, the main goal of clan selection, right? So based on that alone, I'm willing to put it in the winner section, but I think, you know, it is worth bearing in mind, it's very low on the winners list, and I still don't really think Prism changes very much. Although it is probably still worth buying, I will give it that. Next up, we then have Valios. And if there's one thing that makes me, it gives me a little bit of schadenfreude, a bit of sadistic joy, is seeing all the Aqua Force mains I'm surrounded by. Every time a new piece of Aqua Force support drops, seeing their souls get crushed and then fall into a pit of despair. We had it with Thavas, and now we have it again with Valios of just, this is just not very good. And the problem is that they could easily have designed something that was either a backup grade 3 or a complete standalone boss. And what they've done is design something that fits in between and fulfills the jobs of neither. Now, we already have quite a few potential Aqua Force builds that are currently playable in Standard. You've got Maelstrom, you've got Revon, you've got Thavas, and they're all slightly different enough, and they're all strong on their own right enough that they are good decks and all deserve a bit of support. And what does Valios do? Supports none of those and tries to go for a new style of deck that just doesn't quite work. And the problem is, sure, the effect sounds very good on paper, but in practice, in the context of what everything else Aqua Force has going for it, it really doesn't do that much. Like, sure, you have like, what, 8, maybe 9 attacks against your opponent's 8k without defensive triggers, but all it basically does is force your opponent to guard a bit more than they normally would, which they were probably doing for the Revon turn anyway, right? It has some benefits of Revon, but it also has a bunch of extra weaknesses that Revon doesn't have, or it doesn't do the same strengths as Revon. And then you look at Maelstrom, you look at Thavas, and these decks have their own very well-defined strengths that Valius just doesn't even come remotely close to. So again, it's like, well, why would I play this? You know, what does it do for me? Now, bear in mind, the new piece of support are actually pretty solid. They're not amazing. There's a few like odd syntax and odd words here and there that hold them back from being truly, truly good, but they're definitely playable. I think the downside is that when you're juggling 3 decks and you need to make, you either choose to make one of them good and the other 2 not as good, or you make all of them slightly better. To not take either of those options, I think, is very counterintuitive. And so I just want to know what they were thinking when they were like, hey, let's make Valius, it's a new deck all on its own that doesn't even remotely synergize with the other grade 3 bosses. You know, it's kind of like a new deck from scratch, but doesn't do as much either. It's just a little bit depressing. And so because of that, unfortunately, I do have to make Aqua Force a loser this time around, just because it feels like they don't know what they were trying to achieve. And despite not knowing what they were trying to achieve, they failed anyway. Anyway, rounding off clan selection, we have the final one, which is Hamsuke, Great Nature Support. And like I said, this is probably the best deck in clan selection. And I think that's quite impressive, the fact that, you know, clan selection 2 as a whole is very weak, but the best deck is in clan selection 2. Now hear me out. I know it doesn't sound that solid. You know, when you read the effects, they're like, okay, this is decent, this is cool, but it's nothing special, right? And you'd be right. But the thing about Hamsuke is that it's very similar to the Overlord in that its core game plan isn't inherently unfair. What's unfair is the way it carries triggers. If you think about Gavrael, right? Gavrael puts triggers onto Hamiel, who becomes huge, crit, and you can't Sentinel, so you basically die to it. Same with Overlord, it's got Force 2, it's got, you know, plus 10k, and then any triggers it hits requires you to double that shield investment because it's standing twice. And so Hamsuke kind of does a similar thing, but with front triggers, where it builds a board really consistently, fills it, and the moment its power thresholds break your trigger defensives, you're suddenly having to drop so many cards just to not die to it, while at the same time, Hamsuke hasn't really lost much. Like sure, a lot of its effects cost discard, but those discards are coming straight onto the board, and you're having to discard an equal amount of cards just to stay in the game. So it's kind of like war by attrition, and then eventually, like, you know, even if you do survive, just by the sheer virtue of them having more attacks and more cards on the board, you're going to lose that race unless you can draw more than they can attack, which is very hard to do. The thing about Hamsuke is that it's always been a bit of a high roll deck. If you remember back when it won Worlds, however many years ago that was, you know, he hit the ride chain, he filled his board, and he just rushed his opponent down before his opponent could stabilize and threaten a defense back. And Hamsuke just does, you know, the new Hamsuke just does more of that. It just fills the board super quickly. You know, all the pieces of support that came out are all about consistency and helping you set up your combo, set up your ride chain and whatnot. And you can now just, you know, put the beat on super early, super fast, fill a board, keep up that pressure, and basically give your opponent no time to recover while continuously chipping away at them. And like I said, one front is just enough to like break the dam and just turn the tides of the game. Despite how unassuming it may appear and how, you know, boring and weak the rest of Clan Selection 2 may be, I think Hamsuke is by far and away the biggest winner out of both sets combined. So that's going to be it for here. You know, we finished all 24 cards, all 24 clans across 2 videos. If you'd like to recap on Clan Selection 1, you can click the video up in the card up there. There'll be a description down the link below. You can watch them both side by side if that's what you wish. Please do, it gives us a bit of nice little ad revenue. But yeah, that's sort of my early days take, you know, sort of day one opinions, basic level testing of all the clans in Clan Selection. Despite, you know, some being winners and some being losers, like I said in the first video, Clan Selection is all about just having a little bit of fun with Standard. Because there's no tournaments, because there's no need to win events, these cards can now be evaluated on a different axes to normal cards. You don't care about how good they are anymore as cards, you care about how good they are as decks and how good they are as experiences. And so I think in that aspect, most of Clan Selection 2, barring 1 or 2, you know, big offenders, do fulfill that goal. So in terms of, you know, making VTubers a little bit more interesting, making it a little bit more playable, then yeah, I think Clan Selection 2 is overall a success. You know, that much is unquestionable. And if you too would like to pick up any pieces from Clan Selection 2 when it comes out in English, you can do so at the sponsor of this channel, Strictly Broken TCG, using code SBTCG Yellowcard for a discount at checkout. And, like I mentioned, starting from clan selection onwards, this discount code will now apply to singles as well. So thank you very much for supporting the channel, and thank you to you for watching this video, and maybe for watching the previous video because I assumed you watched that as well. We'll be back to our regularly scheduled stream VODs and other miscellaneous content every few weeks as and when time comes. Hopefully after clan selection I'll be able to do a bit more overdress coverage, although a lot of other channels have done that very well, so there's no need for me to repeat information. So check back here for more high-level theory and thinking and sort of how to be a little bit better at the game is, a little bit arrogant way of saying it, but that's how I like to present it. But yeah, let me know your thoughts. What are you interested in for clan selection? How have you playtested these decks yet? And if so, what have been your opinions? Feel free to drop them in the comments, follow us on Twitter, subscribe to the channel, all the good stuff. And we'll see you back very soon. Have a lovely day, take care, and bye-bye.